All right, let's get started. Good afternoon. I'm Randy Sadler with CIC Services. Thrilled to have you join us today for 2022 Emerging Risks and the Compelling Case for Captive Insurance, our webinar today. I'll be your host, Randy Sadler. I'm a principal here at CIC Services, and I'm joined by Eric He, who's interned with us. All right, good. These are our standard disclosures. Of course, we have attorneys. I'm sure you do as well, and so they do require us to disclose some things about captive insurance. So we'll be glad to send these slides to you after today's presentation. If you'd like to discuss these disclosures, we'll be glad to jump on a call to discuss them as well. All right, so we've got a couple pages here of disclosures, and then let's get into the meat of our topic. We start with who is CIC Services. Just so you know who your host is today, we are a captive insurance company manager. In really simple terms, we help businesses set up, own their own insurance company to protect themselves, to hopefully control their commercial insurance costs, to better manage their risk, to keep more of their hard-earned profits. And our team here has over 2 centuries of combined insurance experience and predominantly work in the middle market. And so that's really been our space. Let's go to the next slide, Eric. And really, in just simple terms, I mean, I've got a sheet that's got 15 benefits of captive insurance listed out. But if we really wanted to boil it down to 2 simple things that every business can get excited about, it's the ability to have more insurance and more money at the same time. Now, usually in life, you've got to give up something to get something, right? But this is an exception. It's one of those few exceptions to the rule. You can actually have more insurance protection and more money. So it's like a win-win. All right, let's go to the next slide. Quick bio on me, just so everybody kind of knows, and I'll let Eric give his bio. Again, I'm a principal here at CIC Services. I really learned risk management in the Army. I was a tank commander 5 years. Was also in that time, I was a maintenance officer and logistics officer, and had to deal with fuel, ammunition, keep soldiers safe, especially when moving over large distances. And so, safety risk management was top priority. And I've brought that forward into my career, worked a few corporate roles along the way, but I've been here 10 years at CIC Services. And Eric, tell them about yourself.
Yeah, hi everyone. My name is Eric He. I previously worked at a tech startup, making ad automation models. Then before that, I worked as a web developer for an HOA organization. And actually this fall, I'll be studying data science at Penn State.
Outstanding. So we're fortunate to have Eric work with us this summer. He's done a fantastic job. And one of his projects was to do some heavy duty research, which he's done. I think you're going to find the tables and charts that he's come up with really compelling. You're going to want these slides for your own use wherever you are in risk management or in insurance. All right, let's dive in. So yes. What's our plan today? What are we covering, Eric?
Yeah, so we'll be first covering what are the natural disasters and human disasters, why they're categorized as an emerging risk, what you can do, or what it means to you as a business owner, and finally, what you can do to kind of save your business in case if you have these risks.
Very good. What can they do to prepare? Really important. Okay. So, I think you and I were talking, Eric, when we were putting this together. Natural disasters, human disasters, we've kind of hit a tipping point where they're about 50-50, in terms of dollar amount. It used to be natural were heavier skewed than human, but it's really changed. But even so, natural disasters are seem to be increasing. It may just be because we're reporting on them more, but certainly, every day you can learn about something happening somewhere. So let's talk about those and what it means for business owners.
Yeah, for sure. To start off, we had the California wildfires, which are really kind of seasonal every year. We had the really occasional Texas deep freeze, which is super unprecedented. And we also had a representation of widespread disease and illnesses like COVID-19. And also on the contrary, with aside from naturally occurring disasters, we also have human disasters, which are really the root of the cause are really the people, right? So you have international conflict, which are basically wars, right? Civil unrest, for example, riots. And COVID-19 repeats itself really because, although COVID-19 may be naturally man-made, who knows? But we the people usually kind of infect ourselves with it, human contact and such forth.
Yeah. Right. We're in a very connected planet now, right? Much more than say even 50 years ago.
Exactly. But just to add on to the latter three, we also have the main ones, which are really previously known are supply chain, credit risk, and inflation, because they're economically known as very intercorrelated. But we also have a new one that is cybersecurity, right? So companies are more reliant on technology and the cloud computing. So because as we have more emerging technology, there's always going to be new faults that we don't know. So there's always more risk and new innovations, right?
Yeah, I just saw a stat in Business Insurance today that cyber insurance was up 20% year over year. This is commercial cyber, but that's a gigantic increase in the number of people getting cyber insurance and just the sheer rates going up. But it's a very interesting line of cover because it very often doesn't cover everything. So if you have commercial cyber, there's a good chance you aren't covered for probably the most likely things that could go wrong, which we'll speak to here in a few slides. All right, go ahead, Eric.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so the first thing we'll talk about are the California wildfires. And so the title really suggests that drifting toward being uninsurable, mainly because of the next image I'll show. So here's an image of California in 2020, right? So the smoke fuming in the air, traffic is basically stopped, right? And there's really no I guess if you were to insure, how would you kind of protect your business from going into an inferno, right? So here's a stat by Cal Fire. This is more so like the effect of having a really poor forestry management by the state of California, or as some people would say, this is the result of climate change. But really, from 08 to maybe 2020, like that's like having over maybe even like 500,000 or 200,000 like acres burned by a wildfire. That's pretty huge, considering that what is burned is essentially destroyed, right? So if you have businesses that are just torched, and you don't have any more revenue, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
The last 5 years, the last few years, if you go back a slide, you can really just look at that trend line, that orange trend line from 18 to 20 and up to 20. It's really gone up. California is a huge port state. There's so much that flows through there. Every kind of disruption that hits California tends to affect a lot of us. So much of the Pacific shipping comes through California. So it's not just California's problem, it's all of our problems if we live in the US, right? So keep going. Yeah,
exactly. And just translating this into numbers, really. So in 2021, but by the end of 2021, we have just over 2.5 million acres burned, which really equated to 3,500 buildings destroyed. And it really costs a minimum of 70 billion to 90 billion. So if you divide, the 70 billion by the 3,500 buildings, that could cost upwards of several $1 million just per company or per building. So that within itself is quite monumental, I would say.
it is. Yeah, and we're seeing a lot of insurability in California, and certainly if you can't get commercial insurance, a captive may be the only way to get any insurance at all. It may not cover the limits you need, but it's probably better than no insurance, right? So yeah, let's keep going.
Exactly. Yeah. And so, as we saw in the earlier image about like what a natural disaster entails, we also saw the Texas deep freeze. And so really the title is of Unprepared is really just the statement of that Texas was more reliant on cleaner energy. And so we'll see we'll discuss the effects of that. So,
really, who saw this coming? They got clobbered. Let's talk about why.
Yeah. So this is an interesting chart because the dotted line, if you can see that, it's really the demand forecast, really the quota that you need to hit in order to still keep electricity consistent for the rest of the entire Texas, right? And so we see in the first list of solar, wind, and gas, those are categorized as like the cleaner energy, right? That ESG policies really want to focus on. But the negatives is that solar, wind, and gas are not the same as coal and nuclear, which are, if you look at the bottom of like the navy-ish color and the gold, they remain, those two remain pretty constant, right? But if you take into account like solar, wind, and gas, like during the outages, they were not useful at all, right? So for solar, you need to have a really bright sun with minimal overcast, but we obviously had overcast because of a blizzard essentially. Wind, you need to have a pretty good amount of a breeze to keep on flowing. But maybe even sometimes the windmills will freeze, right? And so natural gas, you need to have a constant pump of or constant flow of natural gas to produce that energy. But the pumps that are made for that aren't even made for the frigid temperatures that occurred in Texas, right? So really, the main point to understand is that although these ESG policies may be beneficial, if you're looking in terms of like the sustainability, I guess just for your business, it's better to kind of maybe analyze it again.
Yeah, regardless of your political views, the reality is, and this chart shows it really clearly, solar, wind, and gas are all reliant on good weather, right? Which we know is, 100% reliable, right? No, it's not. So, if you're in an area where a large part of the power grid is relying on things that don't work in good weather, then the chances for business interruption are enormous, right? And so thinking about how to protect that in your business is really important. Yep.
For sure. And this was really coined as like the 2021's power crisis because, over maybe even 5 million Texans were left without power for just under 3 weeks. And, just under 3 weeks, we had, over 300 casualties, both of which might have, succumbed to, cold related injuries, but also because of COVID-19, right? So all these hospitals relied on these ICU beds, but of course that requires a ton of energy. And so because, Texas cannot supply that energy, they didn't have, I guess as many, backup generators, and that caused with deaths. And so as a result, just the businesses in Texas, maybe even, surpassing Texas, we also had about $200 billion in damages.
Unbelievable. Yeah, convergence of crises, COVID-19 and deep freeze at the same time, or utility outage was the real driver here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so here's just a little figure of how much Texas really relies on cleaner energy. So if you add up solar, natural gas, and wind, that's just around 71%. So just under 3/4 of how much clean energy is reliant for Texas.
All right, the pandemic. Well, we're not going to probably solve the issue of I think I froze there. You still there? Maybe you froze.
Still there.
Oh, there we go. Okay, good. Maybe let's just turn off the video. It might be drawing too much power.
Sure, yeah.
All right, let's talk about the pandemic.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, so just like a little picture of of June 8th, 2022. We had large scale cases and deaths, and all that really halted the global economic trajectories, right? Which really resulted to a skyrocketed unemployment rate, right? And just speaking of towards in supply chain, if you look at the chart on the left, like even when you compare it to the Great Depression, which was I think it's around 88 years from the height of the pandemic, which was in April 2020, the COVID-19 unemployment rate came out to be just over half of the most severe recession in the Western history, right? So, like 25.5% unemployment is like saying, 1 out of every 4 people you see on the street they don't have a job. And you're just having just over half of that in, 2 years ago. I think that's pretty crazy. And really, as a result of this really high unemployment rate, The majority of businesses cannot, really facilitate the circulation of goods, or really, in other words, having a really, like a really good framework for, sustaining businesses. And this really happened because, companies couldn't hire as many people, whether if it's because of COVID-19 or, or maybe of other causes, but, overall goods cannot be manufactured because, supply is going to be even be shifted around, and nor could natural resources, right? And this was also mainly because of inflated costs of the natural resources, right? So really everything kind of came into effect when everything could not really be circulated around. And so as I mentioned, because of the supply chain errors really surfacing, we also had huge inflation, right? So in food, just alone food, we had a 9% increase. Energy, we saw 30%. And now, although energy prices are going down right now, we previously had a huge surge in prices in gas, right? But this was actually starting in April 2022. So so these might actually be a bit lower now. And so really lastly, within COVID-19, I'd like to discuss lockdowns because as we all know, lockdowns are really no fun. It really breaks down your business more than ever. In fact, in 2020, Yelp stated that just over half of their businesses that filed as closed on Yelp, they also remain closed, permanently closed. But really one takeaway they should make is that as with regards to CIC Services, businesses that had captive insurance, had captive entities, they survived. I believe all captive insurance companies survived the pandemic.
Yeah, we had 0 bankruptcies across over 100 clients, and many did have a COVID loss, and a COVID claim was paid. So definitely, having a captive. This was a time when commercial insurance wasn't paying, largely because they would only pay if your property was damaged, your business interruption, or they had pandemic exclusions. Most of our clients had their COVID claims. Well, they had COVID covered. Everyone that filed a claim got it approved, either on their broad form policy, their regulatory legislative policy, or their business interruption policy. So huge difference between having a captive and not having one.
Exactly. Yeah, and so the next thing we'll discuss is international conflict, which is really a nicer term of saying countries who just have really just different mindsets of different policies. So here's an image of Ukraine. I'm not sure which month this was, but in essence, you can see really the tragedies of what war can do to a country, right? You see just smoke still on the ground, and we still see essentially just combat, right? So really no country wants a situation that's occurring in Ukraine. So here's really just what is happening in the just infrastructurally speaking. So for example, the roads, housing, and civilian airports, they're all respectively ranked as number 1, number 2, number 3 of the most damages and cost. And roads are really the most important, I guess, infrastructure in all countries, right? If we look at the U.S., we always see interstates, local roads, and all these are really important because how do you get from point A to point B? You can't really do that if you don't have a really good road system. And so that within itself really just corrupts the entire economy, just getting correct logistics out. But as with housing and civilian airports, those really cater to the actual civilians that are impacted by this war. So if you destroy housing, then how do you really expect people to still survive during this war? You can't really expect that, right? And also as with civilian airports, how do you expect these Ukrainians to really escape the war? You can't really do that because airports I'm sure are being bombed, right? And just looking at this at a more overall view of the damage to it via the GDP, Ukraine's GDP is expected to really toll up to 35%, even up to 40% this year. As we saw in the previous table, that I think total damages exceed around $60 billion. But Russia, on the other side, is it's projected to decline around 8% due to mainly sanctions. But I think that figure is also expected to change because I think Russia's mainly affected, or the 8% is mainly just due to sanctions, but maybe Russia's also losing substantially because of war. They're not really going to win anything really, I guess, right now. So we're expecting that 8% to increase. And so really the main takeaway from this slide is that, when you do have a war, your labor supply is going to shift from really, working for a company to, produce revenue for that company, generate new sales, right? But now that's going to change into, into more military side of having more manpower and really fighting for your country to, protect yourself against a whole recession. Yeah, and so the next slide is really, or this slide is really, really important for showing up. On top of a war, there's also like a food crisis that's occurring, right? So in 2020, Russia and Ukraine, they talked out to maybe I think it's about 30% of the, just around 30% of the market cap, of the total like production or export of wheat. And if you look at the importers of wheat, we see really it encompasses like the entire world. We see Asia, which is in China. We see Egypt. We see Italy, which is Europe. We see Brazil, which is in South America. So we really see that everywhere there is really a whole collective effect that everyone will eventually kind of suffer from this war.
Yeah, this is a very, that's a very telling slide. I mean, Russia and Ukraine, 27% of the world's wheat export right there in a conflict with each other. And look at on the right, all the countries that are relying on, that are importers of wheat. If the war continues and is drawn out, it's going to have other spillover effects and certainly might spawn other wars as well. So definitely something to be ready for. Go ahead, Eric.
Yeah, exactly. So, this food crisis really just causes a big, uncertainty in, food insecurity, right? So, so really, like as I touched on earlier, if countries don't have, wheat, wheat is really the staple crop for many goods, maybe as bread and such. So really, if you take that away, as Russia and Ukraine are probably, just in a really bad state, right now, if you take away that 30%, that's, in general, that's pretty monumental, right? But also, if you also include the fertilizer production, so Russia came to be around second place in 2021 as the greatest potash producer. So potash, if you're unaware, it's really like the ingredient that is found in 95% of all fertilizers that promotes the growth of these crops, as fertilizer is known for, right? So really the effect of that is that it'll aggravate food insecurity, which then will, increase the risk for civil unrest or, in more international conflict. So really the takeaway is that, we do have one effect of, maybe let's say, for example, a war. You also have a food crisis. You also have, additional, growth of these crops, right? But then you also have an energy crisis on top of that to make everything, worse. We all saw that, with gas prices soaring, above maybe like 2 decades high or 3 decades high, right? So it's really crazy how much this war is affecting us. So we see, in 2021 to 2022, Russia was the third greatest producer of crude oil, and they were also the number one producer of natural gas, right? So, in general, it's very clear that Russia has a huge market cap of energy and food. And so, just looking at this from a more like holistic view, especially with regards to the EU, because Russia is the largest producer of natural gas and third for oil, and just looking at this map itself, right? So the Czech Republic relies 100% on the gas from Russia, Hungary 95%, right? Poland 54%. So these are, these aren't small, risks. They're quite large, right? So it's very clear that Russia has a very influential market cap over food and energy prices, which is very detrimental to really everyone, right? So I guess the takeaway is that really, if your market is in the EU or surrounding nations, be sure to kind of monitor these exchanges to prevent any further losses, I guess.
Very good points. So civil unrest, this is a important topic. We've certainly seen our fair share of it in the last few years. What's the impact?
Yeah, for sure. So like the example I used was the Minnesota riots, primarily because it was the most recent in 2021, and also because it was really like the pioneer for extremely violent protests. I mean, although like there were of course protests before 2020, that had, very dangerous, but I believe that this kind of just changed the meaning of dangerous, right? So I mentioned Minnesota also because, it was the second costliest disturbance in the Western hemisphere, right? So so just going back in time, and as number one, highest cost of civil disturbance, it was in 1992 in LA. I personally was not born by then, but maybe as some of you in the audience were. I believe like the aftermath of this war, of this protest, must have been extremely troubling, right? But just a few years ago, Minnesota had that exact thing where under $1 billion or under $500 million was a result of just this one protest. And so when you translate this into numbers, right? So 1,300 buildings were damaged, primarily originating in Minneapolis and St. Paul. But really be sure to note that so Minneapolis and St. Paul are really the origins of the movement. But this also went across to other areas like LA, San Francisco, right, New York City, Chicago. It's really spread out, nationwide. So that within itself costs around 180 million. But when you do factor in like business inventory losses, for which many business owners didn't have the insurance for riots and vandalism, it costs upwards of like $500 million.
Yeah, one of the things that we have encountered as you're changing slides, Eric, is that some businesses that were affected by civil unrest and rioting damage, their insurance policies had exclusions for civil unrest or rioting, and so they just literally didn't have their claims paid. The other thing that's often caused by civil unrest is maybe your building isn't damaged or your business isn't damaged, but clients or customers can't get to you. We had a physician practice in Minnesota that didn't see patients for a long time because there was rioting and there were protests out in front of their location for weeks on end. So it's a double-edged, there's lots of ways you can get hurt. And for many, the only way to insure against it would be a captive insurance company or make sure that your commercial insurance will actually cover you, Yeah.
Right, exactly. Yeah, so.
Yeah, cyber's huge. Let's talk a little bit about cyber risks, what's emerging and how we can think about that.
Yeah, for sure. So last year, a Florida water operator was really hacked by a remote desktop app called TeamViewer. If you know what that is, it's basically this remote app that promotes you, that allows you to access your computer from another location. And so this hacker really wanted to send the levels of lye, which is a caustic chemical, to potentially like dangerous levels in the entire Florida water supply. And really days prior to this hack, things to note is a hacked database, including the login credentials, was used to break into this TeamViewer account. Really, just so coincidentally, right? Just so out of the blue. But this is important to know because like relying on such a powerful app is really not, I guess, recommended because just in this example, really just finding the login credentials through a database hacked really in an instant and having your computer taken over is quite scary just to think about, right? But here's just a stat by IBM Security in 2021 where 4.4 million was the average total cost of a data breach. So maybe if you look at it in the perspective of a small business owner, or a middle market, 4 million is actually quite a lot. Maybe 4 million might even be the total earnings a company might have, and that's just wiped out just because of a data breach, right? And also another thing to note is that this is a 10% year-over-year growth. So maybe this year is 4.4 million, but maybe next year it'll be 4.6 million. And so as that continuously adds up linearly or maybe even exponentially, then that's really like a bigger question of maybe we should actually step up our IT department. And also with regards to social media, we all know that social media apps like Instagram and Facebook, they can all drive sales and client acquisitions through the roof. But really, there are actually many risks just tied to your brand reputation. So reputation damage, right? Yeah. So actually, quoted by Sprout Social, just over half of the customers or consumers you have, they learned about your business through your social media presence. And as Randy mentioned, or at least like the term the double-edged sword, I guess you can really use that in this sense where if you do have a really positive brand image. Of course, like this can be a very good customer retention, having more customers coming back, leaving really positive reviews. But the negative side is that if you have people leaving really terrible reviews, maybe even if it's slander, right? Then this can actually reduce the customer retention and even employee retention, because you might not have enough capital to just supply more employees, and so that will just eventually just lower your customer base tenfold, I guess. And so it's really important to build a sustainable brand image between you and any prospective clients just scrolling across your page, right? Because the more as the more trustworthy you appear, the more willing people are willing to charge for that premium, right? And so I guess the other thing we could really discuss is tech failure, because really, in any innovation, such as maybe a bridge, for example, if someone invented the bridge and a car drove over it and it just happened to break, then you can't really, I guess, like fault that, because eventually in all innovations we always have some sort of failure. So in total, hiring an IT department, I guess this is all annually. So hiring an IT department, you spend in total for the entire globe, we're spending around $61 billion of salaries. That's not really salaries, salaries as in just independent people that you're hiring, right? And so these people also spend around 620 million hours in troubleshooting, not really even solving the actual issue, but just finding the issue, right? And so in the end, this resulted to around $1.2 trillion lost annually. So just think about how 1.2 trillion, and you divide that about like all the companies in total, and maybe your company could also be losing maybe hundreds of thousands of dollars or maybe millions of dollars, right? And so really these failures can really be categorized as maybe a hardware failure, a human error, a software corruption, theft, which is really huge, which we'll cover in the later slides, viruses, and hardware destruction. So IP, also known as like intellectual property, this is really just like the confidential data that you don't really want anyone exploring, right? Yeah, and so essentially what we're seeing here is that people really kind of hack through your or hack your information through either privilege abuse or maybe malware and hacking, right? So privilege abuse is really just having an employee or former employee maybe stealing any information that they shouldn't have, just because they get access to access to do that. But hacking and malware is also really common because really they can implant malware on your computer, and they could kind of loophole that into privilege abuse where your employee might not be doing anything wrong, but they're really just taking the IP through your employees. So it's really important to have the education on respecting these boundaries, I guess, and not having malware even being implanted on your computer in the first place.
IP can be particularly difficult to ensure commercially. Sometimes we find that, especially for tech companies, the only way they can really protect their IP, in addition to taking all the safeguards that you said here, is to insure it in a captive, which can help them if they need to go sue to protect their IP or block a competitor, or sometimes they're the one being accused. So captive insurance can be particularly useful for tech companies who have IP risk. Yeah. Okay. Next slide. All right. Yeah. Supply chain. This is a big one. Eric, cover these slides here. We've all been very aware that supply chain has been choked off, at least some. It's certainly one of the contributors to the inflation that we're experiencing, but it's also part of being in a kind of a global connected marketplace. So what are we seeing in the supply chain front?
Yeah, for sure. So so like I guess like a really good example that we saw in 2021 last year was like the Suez Canal obstruction, which really it wasn't the only supply chain disruption, but it really did reveal our united dependence on really efficient logistics. And once we had a failed one, and then like everything came apart, right? So really at least with this topic, it's really that time is money, right? So at least with with all like the contents on the or I guess on the canal, really it really sold up to $10 billion of contents per day of the total 6 days. And the effect of that just to the Egyptian government well, was that they lost around 3% of their 2021 total revenue. So they lost around $90 million. And so in 2021, they were on $2.7 billion. To divide 90 million by 2.97, that's around 3%. Just lost in 6 days, which is less than a week, which I think is quite amusing, but it's also quite terrible for them, right?
Yeah, that's quite a toll booth operator business there.
Yeah.
Almost $3 billion of tolls.
Exactly. Yeah, and also within supply chain, we also see how the media, portrays, labor shortages. So, a lot of people kind of think that, employees are quitting just for the sake of quitting because, maybe they're too overworked. But really, what's happening is really just like the redo of the, great resignation, where, as the economy expands, we have more jobs. And usually, these are companies that are seeking for better talent, which really provide, better work-life balance options, or the ability to work from home, or maybe just a higher wage. And because of this, we're really seeing it's like a 7% increase for these typical job hoppers. So, and maybe, Yeah, and so the last thing to discuss in supply chain are really the inventory and material shortages. So as with inventory shortages, so really once the U.S. injected the stimulus into the economy, people really had disposable income, right? Having thousands of dollars just through the government for free, right? So really what we had was this bounce back, which consumer demands definitely exceeded current supply of what we had because of the supply chain. We just couldn't get goods moving around the nation, right? And so this really kept prices high. The inflation was through the roof, as we saw, and this was also mainly caused by material shortages, right? So, let's say, for example, if I were to go to a car dealership and ask for a car, well, they might have even, doubled the price of that car just because, the demand is so high, there's so little to actually sell.
Mm-hmm.
And so material shortages is, I guess, an example for the car dealership example. It's really it's for the semiconductor chips. On the Bloomberg chart, we see how by 2020 or 2030 we'll have these cars that rely 45% just on these chips, and we really don't want to have a redo of what we had these past years in Chrome this year, where TSMC, which is like the Taiwan semiconductor company, we really don't want to have a really large widespread shortage of these chips, and also this a cause of this really large spread shortage is that we had other products that were using chips, like your phone, like Apple phones, or your computer, or even just medical imaging tools, like for COVID-19 research or cancer research, right? So when you have this widespread this whole slew of products that use chips, it's really kind of hard to prioritize, aside from really just maxing the production. And also another thing that could really be into play is the rising tension between the East and the West, whether if it's the U.S. and China, or U.S. and Taiwan, really. And it's really the result of that was a loss of 210 billions that could have been potentially made in trades, and just around 7.7 million cars can have be built in that time.
Yeah, and this, like you said, I believe Taiwan manufactures half the world's chips, and there's obviously tension around Taiwan if you watch the news lately, and so that could really disrupt a lot of the world's economy, frankly. So, yeah. All right. Well, credit risk. This is something we don't always think about, but if you remember 2008, there were a lot of businesses that had their loans called, especially if they had some real estate collateral that maybe went down in value, et cetera. It's certainly something we may face again, in addition to other potential credit risks. Eric, tell us about those.
Yeah, for sure. Like looking at this chart, if you look from 2000, 2005, specifically around 2005, because if you look at like the upticks, right, like those are rate hikes, interest rate hikes by the Federal Reserve, and we can see that they're quite gradual, but they're very small upticks. But when you compare that to 2022's on the far bottom right corner, we see that June of 2022, it had a 75 basis point hike, which really, if you just compare the size of that tick, compared to 2005. It could be upwards of 4 to 5 times, just eyeballing, right, the size. So really, the Fed is doing this just to combat the soaring inflation, as we saw. And literally, if you bought bread, it will be maybe 10% higher, and that's that's terrible. If you're for all parties involved, right?
Yeah.
And so really, like, as I mentioned earlier about like the U.S. injecting stimulus to really reignite the business ventures of all companies and people involved. Really, consumers finally had the disposable income, right? But this also was included with pretty much like almost zero interest rates, right? Which really exaggerated inflation because people could max out maybe their credit cards or maybe just buy a house for the cheapest price possible because their inflation was so little, or not inflation, their interest rate was so low. So really, in effect, the Fed hiked the rates, and at the 75 basis point rate hike to eventually taper, or in their mind, they wanted to eventually taper consumer borrowing and spending, but because this was such an abruptly high rate hike, we're expecting a slowdown in earnings for companies because just because company or not consumers don't have enough really money to even pay for anything anymore, right? Like they can't even borrow money on their credit card, so how are they expected to kind of buy products from your company? And this also will increase the pressure for governments, right? So because I'm sure most companies will spend a decent amount of money just for taxes, and so once these governments have a substantially decreased tax revenue, then how will they operate? And so really, companies and the governments are having a pretty equal amount of budget pressure.
Yeah. Very good point. So obviously recession, which if you know the technical definition of recession, we are in one, 2 quarters with negative growth. But then we've got that combined with inflation and rising interest rates. So a little bit of a 1970s feel, not quite there yet, but maybe heading that way. Tell us about that risk as well as business owners think about grappling with the future, Eric.
Yeah, for sure. In this chart provided by Bloomberg, I believe our inflation is actually maybe higher than 9%. Maybe it might be 10% this year or right now. But as of this chart, it shows us 9%. But even then, it just shows that it was higher. It was the highest in more than 40 years, right? And that's quite a large period of time, just to be inflation. And this was even, if you look at the bottom part, it says this was the biggest gain since 2005, which I'm sure is just generally quite monumental. And so this really questions the term of stagflation. So stagflation, if you're not sure, it's basically like this combination of having a really slow economic growth, which is really high, which is really caused by high unemployment rates, really high inflation rates, usually caused by a sporadic interest rate hike, which is really coincidentally what's happening right now, funnily enough. And really what we're seeing is so like the Russian-Ukraine war, assuming like the food crisis, the energy crisis, we're also seeing a bunch of fertilizer issues, right? So we're seeing everything, all the affected goods, all their prices are increasing substantially. And also because of these aggressive rate hikes, we're seeing how companies are losing money, or maybe not losing money, but they're not making as much money as they should be, and governments aren't really making as much money as they should be either. And so really, just to combat the Fed, this abrupt interest rate hike may really break down the economy more, as opposed to just slowing down inflation and calmly tapering off the consumer spending, which it may be, but right now it's very uncertain for that.
Yeah, so I think the key here for business owners, and this is what you've kind of documented, Eric, is to be ready for the uncertainty. And there are some proactive steps that businesses can take right now. Some of them are mitigation strategies, and some of them are just planning. And then there's also a need to look at commercial insurance and the exclusions that may exist there, or places that insurance should be placed. And then no surprise for many businesses, the best solution is captive insurance, because what we outlined earlier, the ability to have more insurance and more money can really create the broadest protection possible. So Eric's put together, I think you've got like 3 pages here, Eric, is that right? And why don't we cover a few of these? If you'd like these slides, we're not going to have time to hit everything that he's laid out, but we'll hit a few of the high points. And if you'd like these slides, we'll be certain we'll try to cover these slides in about 5 minutes and then leave a few minutes for questions. We're getting close to the top of the hour. So let's dive in.
Yeah, so I mean, I guess to start with number one, you should really evaluate your supply chain, right? If you could, it's really, it's very probable to have, vulnerable vendors if you're, in the wrong geography, whether it's like international policies or whatnot. But you should really consider, having alternate backup vendors established, as well as just carrying more inventory, right, in case of a supply chain error is really in place.
Absolutely. So, supply chain can be insured commercially. Just make sure that the policy is a good policy and covers everything. We for example, last year had a new client, and they actually export vegetables, fruit, nuts, and their insurance policies just weren't covering their real risks, which are a port rejecting them, and then spoilage. And so now we've got them covered in a captive, but it works coming the other way too, right? So that's a really important one. Maybe let's jump down to utility outages, because we're seeing more and more of that here in the U.S. Eric, what are your thoughts there?
Yeah, exactly. As mentioned with the Texas outage, right? So it's really important to have a backup power generation, whether if it's powered by gas or diesel, but regardless, you still need some sort of energy if you are in a state of utility outages. And it's also really important to consider insulating important infrastructure, whether it's water pipelines, because during freezing temperatures the water can eventually dam the pipes, and that'll cause substantial losses, just maybe not having a water supply, right?
Yeah, so this is one. I mean, when you think about utility outages, it spills over into every part of your business. So whether you have generators, insulation, whatever it takes, evaluate the market that you're in and where you're selling and your exposure to power outages. I mean, one of the things that we're very fortunate about here in Tennessee is we have hydro and we have coal-powered steam plants, and usually the weather doesn't affect either one of those. So some places have it maybe better than others, but certainly captives can ensure business interruption, supply chain interruption, anything that utilities might interrupt if you can't get coverage in your commercial policy. So you want to look at that as well. Yeah, let's go to the next slide, Eric. Yeah, how about cyber? This is a really important one.
Yeah, so as I touched on earlier about how employees could also be the human error in cybersecurity losses, right? Maybe you consider hiring someone else to really train your workers on how to maybe browse the internet, or just reduce the likelihood of getting malware on your device, right? And it's also really important to have a designated IT department, to have just that designated the people to really solve anything that does happen if you do have a cyber attack.
Yeah, and it's so important to look at your commercial insurance if you have it for your cyber, for any exclusions in that policy, anything it doesn't cover. A lot of the things that, as Eric alluded to, human error is where a lot of cyber begins, and a lot of policies exclude that. So you may need to think about owning your own insurance company, insuring cyber in a more broad policy. So let's think about reputation, perhaps, Eric. What are your thoughts there?
Yeah, for sure. I think throughout time we've always been, I guess just businesses in general, they've always been very big competitors, and so when you do have competitors, and I guess it's really important to kind of not be in a position to have them impact your business reputation negatively, whether it's even fake news like slander. So maybe ensuring your reputational damages through captive, that'll be one way of solving that. But also aside from your competitors slandering you, it can also be by a media outlet. So maybe having a public relations agency to combat that, or having a another company to avoid all this controversy would also be beneficial.
Yeah, one thing about reputation is if the media tarred and feathered you inappropriately, you may have to sue them to stop them. And then you may have to do a PR campaign to set the record straight and overcome their damage. We've actually had that happen with a few of our clients. A good reputation risk policy will fund that fight. And so, really, really, really important. All right, let's go to the next page, Eric.
Yeah, so I guess if you just want to move down to maybe like evaluating a risk from a civil unrest perspective, as I touched on earlier with regards to like our civil unrest section, like the really big question is, are your business clients or suppliers are they in areas where civil unrest is very possible? As Randy mentioned about civil unrest with with a client's business where with even protests, clients might not even want to do business with you if it's so problematic, just it's outside of your office building. So really you should consider hiring maybe security services to prevent that unwanted violence surrounding your business complex, right? But I guess Randy can explain the commercial insurance policies for such.
Yeah, so one of the things that civil unrest can create two things. One is property damage that's not covered. Perhaps your commercial insurance doesn't cover it, or the damage goes beyond your policy limits. So this is a place where a captive can play a huge role. And civil unrest also, as I mentioned, can cause business interruption just because your clients can't get to you, or a shipping route is blocked, or many things. Just think about loss of access to a property or a market. And so very often commercial insurance business interruption only triggers with damage, and civil unrest can sometimes cause no damage, just cause interdiction. So this is why looking at captive insurance can be particularly important. All right, let's go to the next slide, Eric. All right, good. Yeah, we talked about this a little bit earlier. Why consider captive insurance as we think about how tumultuous the world is right now, and the reason is quite simple. On the next page, which is what we talked about earlier. It's one of the only solutions that gives you, more of two things: more insurance and more money in the insurance company. So if you have one of these crises and you're insured for it, the captive can deal with it from a claims standpoint. In the situation where you might have a crisis that's not insured, despite your best efforts to think about all the risks that you could be facing, then the money in the captive could be accessed via, say, a dividend or a loan to address the challenge. And so it is the best survival vehicle that we know of. All right, good. That brings us to kind of the end here.